So what if I told you that the scrap metal from some junked car could literally be the exact material holding up the skyscraper you work in? And that, like, making that specific swap actually saves about 67% in energy consumption.
Yeah, it completely changes how you look at the physical world around you. I mean, a building stops being just this static structure, and it suddenly becomes this temporary holding zone for resources that used to be something else entirely.
Right. Today, we are tearing down the corporate buzzwords because, you probably hear terms like sustainability and circular economy thrown around all the time,
Oh.
usually by companies just like slapping a little green leaf on their
Oh,
packaging.
absolutely. The classic greenwash.
Exactly. They talk about reducing waste, and suddenly they want to be known as this circular, sustainable brand. But those two concepts are not the same thing. In fact, treating them like interchangeable buzzwords is masking a really massive shift in how businesses actually operate.
Yeah, conflating them fundamentally misunderstands, the mechanics of modern industry. It's akin to confusing a bicycle with a high-speed rail network just because they both happen to move you from point A to point B.
Wow. Okay. That's a huge difference.
Right. I mean, the scale, the infrastructure, and especially the underlying intent are entirely different.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to strip away the jargon, we are going to explore a really fascinating 2020 study by researchers Hussain and Malik. They mapped out the hard boundaries between sustainable supply chains and the circular economy.
Which is such an important distinction to make.
Yeah, and more importantly, they looked under the hood to reveal exactly what it takes for a company to radically change its operational reality. So we are looking at the actual mechanical levers a company has to pull to move away from a traditional model.
Well, before we analyze how an organization changes its supply chain, we really have to establish what they are trying to change into. Hussain and Malik's paper draws a very hard line between sustainable supply chain management, which we'll just refer to as SSCM, and the circular economy, and the distinction begins entirely with how the system views raw resources.
So the paper defines SSCM as being focused on just minimizing the negative footprint. It's your classic, reduce, recycle, and reuse model.
Or
But the literature slaps a rather unflattering label on this. They actually call it weak sustainability.
Yeah, but I should clarify, it is an economic classification, not like a moral judgment.
Oh, okay.
It's labeled weak because the underlying assumption of SSCM is that raw materials are still essentially abundant.
Got it.
The goal of a sustainable supply chain is simply to use slightly less of those resources per unit produced. So it's an incremental innovation. You take materials from the earth, you manufacture a product, and eventually that product is discarded.
So it's still a straight line.
Exactly. The organization is just trying to make that linear journey a little less damaging.
Okay, so you are slowing down the depletion of resources,
Mhm.
but the depletion is still happening.
Right. That is the core limitation. Contrast that with the circular economy, which the study describes as an idealist philosophy. A circular model is restorative and regenerative by its very design.
Okay, so no straight lines at all.
Right. The objective isn't to just use less raw material. The objective is to completely narrow, slow, and close resource loops so that virtually zero new virgin materials are injected into the system. And the academic term for this is strong sustainability.
Which requires fundamental structural changes to the way physical goods are produced. Like, it's a radical innovation.
Yeah.
But let me push back on this boundary for a second.
Sure.
If a company is heavily recycling its own waste, aren't they closing the loop? To put this into a physical space is sustainable supply chain management, like putting a bucket under a leaky roof so the floor doesn't rot as fast.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Well, the circular economy is like ripping off the roof and building a pitched, self-draining structure where the water is automatically channeled into a garden.
Yes. That captures the physical reality perfectly. The bucket is mitigating damage, right? It reacts to a flaw in the system.
Yeah.
But the pitch roof eliminates the concept of the leak altogether by actually utilizing the element. So the fundamental difference between the two paradigms is proactive design versus reactive management.
Proactive versus reactive.
Makes sense. SSCM sees waste as an inevitable byproduct of doing business. But the circular economy operates on the premise that if you have waste, your design is fundamentally flawed. A perfectly circular system aims to sustain the circulation of materials indefinitely.
It's a total paradigm shift from, doing less bad to doing good by design.
Yeah.
But getting past the philosophy brings up a massive logistical wall. Because, In a theoretical paper, a circular economy sounds elegant.
But
But
absolutely.
how does that actually function out in the wild across thousands of miles of complex supply chains?
To map that out, we really have to look at how the loops are physically closed. The researchers identified two main avenues here: closed-loop supply chains and open-loop supply chains. So a closed loop is restricted to an individual company's boundaries. Think of an electronics manufacturer taking back its own used laptops, stripping the parts, refurbishing them, and selling them again.
Which is a solid step, but I imagine you eventually hit a ceiling. Like you can only recycle your own specific product so many times before the materials degrade, or you simply don't get enough units returned to keep your manufacturing lines running.
Exactly. That limitation is why the circular economy relies heavily on open-loop supply chains. This is where material recovery happens completely outside the original company's ecosystem. And this introduces one of the most critical concepts of the circular model, which is industrial symbiosis.
Here's where it gets really interesting: industrial symbiosis. The core idea here is that the waste or byproducts of one specific industry become the highly valued raw input materials for a completely unrelated industry.
It requires looking at the industrial landscape as like an interconnected ecosystem rather than a series of isolated silos.
Yeah, let's look at the specific examples the study highlights because they illustrate the mechanics of this beautifully. There is this Australian company mentioned called Close the Loop.
Oh, that's a great example.
Right. So they're taking old printer cartridges, soft plastic waste, and recycled glass. Now, normally, those are three entirely different problematic waste streams, but they combine them to create an additive for road surfaces like for asphalt.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. And the resulting recycled asphalt actually lasts 65% longer than traditional newly mined asphalt.
And you have to notice the shift in value there. They aren't just recovering materials to make some cheaper, inferior product. By acting symbiotically, the final product is actually superior in its durability.
Yeah, it's better than the original.
Exactly. The lifespan of the road is extended, which means less future maintenance and less future resource extraction.
The industrial boundaries just kind of vanish in that scenario.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the companies printing office memos and manufacturing plastic packaging are acting as the tier one raw material suppliers for the heavy construction industry.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this cross-sector sharing is what turns a standard linear supply chain into a true circular supply chain network. The study outlines several of these cross-industry pipelines.
Like the paper industry one, right?
Yeah, so in the paper supply chain, the traditional linear model involves logging, pulping, and manufacturing. And the bark stripped from the trees is often considered this low-value waste.
Just junk to be thrown away.
Right. But through industrial symbiosis, pulp mills redirect those waste bark chips into the fuel supply chain, acting as a biomass energy source for heating plants.
Or the automotive example we touched on at the start. An automotive supply chain accumulates significant metal scrap. And normally, recycling that scrap within their own closed loop involves this highly energy-intensive melting process.
Which kind of defeats the purpose of saving energy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So instead, they bypass that entirely and transfer the metal scrap directly to the construction industry to be used as raw material for building facades. That specific symbiotic exchange is what netted the 67% reduction in energy consumption.
And that 67% metric represents a staggering operational victory. But achieving it requires an organization to completely abandon the traditional tunnel vision of supply chain management.
Okay, look, this sounds brilliant in theory. The pulp mill sends bark to the heating plant. The car manufacturer sends metal to the construction site. But I am stuck on the real-world friction here.
It's a lot of friction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't just call up a construction site manager and say, hey, I've got 3 tons of jagged metal scrap. Can I just dump it on your lot tomorrow? Like, who pays for the trucks? How does the heating plant even know the pulp mill has bark available? How does a company actually build these symbiotic ecosystems?
That logistical friction is the central focus of Hussain and Malik's research. To figure out how organizations cross that chasm, they utilized a theoretical framework called organizational sense-making. It posits that moving from a linear lock-in to a circular network doesn't just happen organically. The organization has to deliberately initiate specific process facilitators.
Let's break down organizational sense-making. What does that actually mean for the people running the business?
Well, it is the process by which a company collectively observes a chaotic or complex environment like, say, an entire global supply chain and assigns meaning to it so they can act.
So wrapping their heads around the chaos.
Precisely. To actually make sense of the shift toward a circular model, the study isolates two primary process facilitators that have to be deployed. The first is collaboration within the supply chain network, which the paper abbreviates as COL.
And this has to go way beyond, like, signing a standard buyer-supplier purchasing contract.
Immensely beyond. Collaboration in this context means establishing a nervous system across different industries. It involves sharing deep proprietary information, co-investing in research and development, and really building shared technological infrastructure.
The study mentions using big data and the Internet of Things. So this is about setting up digital tracking to monitor the reverse flow of products. Like, if I'm the pulp mill, I need a digital dashboard connected to the heating plant so I know exactly what their burn rate is and they know exactly how many tons of bark I'm producing this week.
Information is the literal lifeblood of industrial symbiosis. You cannot exchange a byproduct if you are blind to who needs it, what their exact specifications are, or when they need it delivered.
Right.
But the data is only half the battle. The second process facilitator is supply chain configuration, or SCC. This is the physical, concrete side of the equation.
So physically redesigning your warehouses, changing your transportation routes, and overhauling your logistics network to handle materials moving backward.
Yes. Traditional manufacturing is optimized for a linear flow. Materials move cleanly from the raw supplier to the factory and then out to the customer.
Nice and tidy.
Exactly. Redesigning that infrastructure to simultaneously accept chaotic, unpredictable waste coming back up the chain or moving sideways to a different industry is a monumental undertaking.
And this brings us to a highly counterintuitive finding from the study. Because to test how these facilitators work, the researchers surveyed 175 different firms in the United Arab Emirates, spanning manufacturing, services, and the oil and gas sector.
Right, a really solid data set.
Yeah, and when they crunched the data on these organizations, they found that collaboration, so the deep sharing of data and knowledge and configuration, the physical restructuring of the warehouses, do not naturally trigger one another. They are entirely distinct hurdles.
Which is fascinating because many business leaders assume that if you solve the communication problem, the physical logistics will just naturally follow. The data shows that is a dangerous assumption.
Let's explore why that is. If two companies have established a great symbiotic partnership, they are sharing their IoT data, and they know exactly what materials need to be swapped. Wouldn't they just automatically reroute their trucks to make it happen? Why doesn't the intellectual alignment trigger the physical change?
It really comes down to the sheer geographical and physical complexity of reverse logistics. Look, setting up a joint database and aligning your corporate goals is a massive intellectual achievement. But supply chain configuration involves moving atoms, not just bits.
Moving atoms. I like that.
The reverse flow of waste is notoriously volatile. When a truck goes out to pick up returned products or industrial byproducts, you often just don't know the exact quantity you're going to get.
Or the quality. Like if you are collecting used soft plastics for that asphalt mixture we talked about, you might get a batch that is heavily contaminated with food waste or non-recyclable adhesives.
Which means the receiving company suddenly has a massive sorting problem, a contamination hazard, and a disposal cost they didn't anticipate. You might have the best collaborative data sharing in the world, but if your receiving bays aren't physically built with the specialized sorting equipment to grade incoming scrap, the material flow just bottlenecks. Reconfiguring global, dispersed supply chains to absorb that unpredictability requires massive capital expenditure.
So there are two totally separate beasts.
The researchers emphasize that management must treat collaboration and configuration as two independent, heavily resourced projects.
Okay, so we have the philosophical objective, strong sustainability through the circular economy, and we have the mechanical blueprints, collaboration for the data and configuration for the physical assets.
Right.
But what actually motivates an organization to go through this immense pain and expense? Let's be real. Tearing up a highly optimized, profitable, linear supply chain to build unpredictable circular loops is not something a board of directors approves just for good PR.
No, the risk is way too high for it to be a superficial marketing stunt. And this leads to the most vital component of the entire study.
The secret sauce.
Exactly. The structural elements, so the data networks and the new truck routes, are mandatory, but they are completely insufficient on their own. To actually initiate the change, the organization needs what the researchers call an organizational narrative, or OR.
The human element of the machinery.
Yes. The study defines this as the discursive ability of an organization to establish a shared understanding based on normative grounds, which leads to what they call a double mediation effect.
Well, hold on. Discursive ability, normative grounds, double mediation effect. That sounds like a graduate-level seminar on organizational psychology.
It is a bit does.
Let's translate that for the manager standing on the factory floor trying to get things done. What does that actually look like?
Fair enough. Let's strip away the academic terminology. Discursive ability simply means how well the people in the company communicate and shape each other's reality.
Okay.
Normative grounds means deep foundational beliefs, not just passing trends. So an organizational narrative is essentially a deeply rooted company-wide belief system about why this transition is happening.
So it's not just a memo from the CEO saying, hey, we are going green. It's everyone from the logistics planners to the forklift drivers genuinely understanding the economic and environmental necessity of the shift.
That shared understanding is crucial. And the double mediation effect is how that belief physically changes the company. Think of it like a powerful engine driving a sequence of gears.
Okay, I'm visualizing the gears.
The internal culture, the narrative, doesn't magically reduce carbon emissions by itself. Instead, the narrative acts as the engine that forces the first gear to turn, which is the collaboration. Because the employees believe in the line, they fight to build those data sharing networks.
Oh, I see.
And then that collaboration turns the second gear, the configuration. The shared knowledge forces the company to finally spend money to physically rebuild the warehouses. The belief drives the communication, which drives the physical reconstruction.
So what does this all mean? If you are a business leader listening to this, you cannot just purchase expensive supply chain management software, and you cannot just hire a logistics consultant to redraw your shipping routes.
It won't work.
If you attempt the physical change without the cultural alignment, the friction of reverse logistics will just tear the project apart. You essentially have to build the belief system first to give your teams the resilience to handle the structural nightmare of tearing down a linear lock-in.
This raises an important question regarding the nature of leadership in the modern industrial landscape. True sustainability cannot live isolated in a public relations department.
Right.
It has to be an operational orientation that shapes the daily cognitive approach of every employee. The data from the 175 firms in the UAE proved that without the social construction of the company's values, the structural process facilitators just fail to materialize. Transitioning to a circular supply chain is as much an exercise in human psychology as it is in industrial engineering.
It bridges the gap between hard operational logistics and human motivation in a really tangible way. It shows why some companies succeed at this and why others just end up putting out press releases.
It really reveals the hidden architecture of corporate change.
Let's bring this all back to you, the listener. Why does this deep dive matter for your day-to-day life? Because whether you are a manager tasked with implementing sustainable practices in your own organization, or you are just a consumer standing in an aisle looking at a brand's green claims on a product label, you now possess a highly calibrated filter.
You know what to look for.
Exactly. You understand the profound difference between weak, incremental sustainability, the bucket under the leaky roof, and a radical circular paradigm shift. To look past the buzzwords and look for the structural intent.
Are they actually changing the system?
Right.
Yeah.
Is the company just trying to slow down their resource depletion? Or are they actively doing the agonizing work of collaborating across industries, physically reconfiguring their warehouses, and redesigning their systems so that waste is eliminated entirely?
And exploring that structural intent leaves us with a final, lingering thought to consider. The study makes it abundantly clear that breaking the linear lock-in, so dismantling a deeply entrenched, highly optimized global supply chain, is incredibly difficult, expensive, and chaotic for legacy corporations.
It's like churching an aircraft carrier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The researchers even hint that new startups have a distinct advantage in building circularity from scratch because they don't have to deconstruct an old empire first.
They are circular native from day one. They start with the pitched roof.
Exactly. So as we watch global industries attempt to navigate resource scarcity, we have to ask ourselves, will the transition to a truly circular economy ultimately be led by massive legacy corporations slowly and painfully turning their massive ships around? Or will those giants find themselves unable to rewrite their organizational narrative fast enough, only to be entirely replaced by a new generation of circular native startups that never had a linear lock-in to begin with?
Wow, that is a question that every executive at a legacy company should be asking themselves right now. Are they redesigning the building or just buying bigger buckets? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of the circular economy. We hope you walk away seeing the physical and the corporate world just a little bit differently today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next one.